Welcome, everybody, to Trauma Informed Care and Responding to Sexual Abuse Disclosure. This webinar is brought to you by the Northeast Mental Health Service Coordination Alliance, NEMHSCA. Today we have two presentations for you. The first one is by Nicole Sadler from Phoenix, Australia, the National Centre of Excellence for Post Traumatic Mental Health. And the second one is by Kim Robinson, the Northern Centre Against Sexual Assault, Northern CASA. My name is Sarah Officer. I am the Project Coordinator for NEMHSCA, and it is so great to have you here today. Today we are meeting on Slido, and the purpose of this is so that you can interact with us. You should see on your screen you have the option to post your own questions and like other people's questions. Please do this throughout the presentations, and at the end of each one, we'll have the opportunity to ask Nicole and Kim some of the questions. If you cannot see these options, try going to slido.com and entering the event code V567. We are live right now and open to the general public. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can find a link to Tech Support Discord in your Eventbrite invitation email. We'll also be using polling. We want to know what sector you're from and how you feel about working with and responding to people who may have experienced trauma and sexual abuse. So let's talk briefly about NEMHSCA. So NEMHSCA is an inter-organisational service coordination alliance. We have 20 member organisations from across mental health, drug and alcohol, youth, family and community services. Within this alliance, we have a professional development working party, who are a group of senior leaders who meet to develop events for the regional workforce. This webinar has been designed by that working party, who surveyed the workforce earlier in the year and found out that trauma-informed care was a top priority. You can find out more information about NEMHSCA by going to our website, www.emphn.org.au, and typing in NEMHSCA. You will also find a recording of this webinar and the PDFs to the PowerPoints. You will also find our sister alliance, NEMHSCA's webinars on there as well. So I'd like to begin this webinar by acknowledging that the land NEMHSCA services operate on is Aboriginal land. That land was never ceded, but stolen, and the effects of this dispossession contributes to significant intergenerational trauma and ongoing pain. The Wurundjeri and Taungurung people of the Kulin Nation are the traditional custodians of this land, of which they have protected for thousands of years. NEMHSCA recognises the impact of colonisation and the systemic racism that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have endured, and we show respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person that is watching today. NEMHSCA also recognises the important contribution to the design and delivery of health and community services by people with a lived experience and their support. We welcome and celebrate diversity. The North East region of Metro Melbourne supports so many cultures and communities. NEMHSCA recognises that a disproportionate number of people from marginalised communities experience poorer health outcomes, and these experiences are interrelated with discrimination. NEMHSCA is committed to being an entity that promotes safety and inclusivity for the health and well-being of our diverse cultures and communities. I'd like to acknowledge that we are living in a time of great adversity, and many people are experiencing hardships and chronic stress from the impacts of coronavirus. Today we are talking about trauma and sexual abuse, and these topics may impact some people. Please look to these helplines and resources for support, and please be mindful that if you're working from home, that you're in a quiet and safe room. Be mindful of children around you. Wear a headphone or headset if you can, and take breaks from the webinar if you need. If you would like further training from Phoenix, Australia, or you would like to make a referral to Northern CASA, Nicole and Kim will give you further details at the end of their presentation. I would like to now introduce Nicole Sadler from Phoenix, Australia to present on trauma-informed care, and I'll see you after the presentation for some questions.
Hello, my name is Nicole Sadler. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work for Phoenix Australia, the Centre for Post Traumatic Mental Health. I'm going to be giving a presentation about trauma informed care and how you can apply the principles to your own workplace. Just going to share my screen for you. And just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and in this case it's the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. As I said, I work for Phoenix Australia, the Centre for Post Traumatic Mental Health. We're a not-for-profit independent organisation which is affiliated with the University of Melbourne. We've been around for 25 years and our mission is all about improving the well-being and quality of life for those people who may be impacted by trauma, whether that's individuals, organisations or communities. We do a lot of work with defence and security, emergency services organisations, but also community workers and those communities which have been impacted post a disaster. One of the key things that we do is that we write the treatment guidelines for those people who've been impacted by trauma, and we're just about to release this month the latest version of those, which provides the up-to-date evidence on what are the best treatments for helping people to deal with either acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD. One of the key principles of trauma-informed care is making sure that you understand trauma and its impact. So that's one of the topics that we're going to be talking about briefly. And then I'm going to describe what some of the principles of trauma-informed care are and discuss some of the tips and strategies that you can use in terms of how you apply those principles with your clients in your workplace. And one of the things I'd like to emphasise is that these are the things that can be used across any organisations that are working with people who may be impacted by trauma. They're principles that can be applied throughout the organisation. It doesn't have to be just by people who are mental health professionals, but by anyone who might be doing any type of client work. Administrators, but also non-mental health professionals. So let's talk about trauma and its impact. Trauma, of course, can be many things. It's more than something which just is a stressful event, but it's really that whole idea that it might be something which is a one-off event or an isolated event, such as a motor vehicle accident or an armed robbery, or it might be something which is repeated and chronic. So, for example, domestic violence or family violence or child sexual abuse. It may be chronic, such as homelessness. It may be something which is human-made, for example, war or natural disasters. We also know that sometimes trauma exposure comes from interpersonal relations, so things like rape, family violence, one-on-one assaults. And in particular, the impacts that we see for people over time can be very difficult if it has come from those interpersonal relationships. So we think about chronic interpersonal traumas such as childhood sexual abuse being particularly difficult for individuals. So the sorts of things that can make an event potentially traumatic are that someone feels threatened either to themselves or to others. So it might be threat of serious injury or even death or sexual violation. Often it's sudden or unexpected, but not always. Some of the traumas that we see, for example, in military and police and emergency services can in fact be a predictable and maybe even an inevitable part of their job, but it doesn't mean that those things aren't necessarily traumatic still. They can be prolonged, repeated and intense, or they may be one-off. They may be personally witnessed or experienced, or they may be that you're hearing about these things happening for someone who is very close for you. And in particular, we see that these events are evoking those feelings of things like intense fear or feeling helplessness or powerlessness or being particularly overwhelmed by something. The experience of a potentially traumatic event is in fact pretty common. And the best statistics that we have were done back in 2007 by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but they told us up to 75% of Australians in some time in their life have experienced a potentially traumatic event, and in fact most of them had experienced it by the age of 16 years old. About 10 to 15% of people have experienced a natural disaster. And what we also know that this doesn't necessarily mean that people will go on to have prolonged experiences in terms of something like a post-traumatic stress disorder, and that the general prevalence that we see across the community is about 6%, but prevalence rates really do shift according to different experiences and different communities or professions, etc. And in general, for example, we see higher rates in homelessness or in people who've experienced rape, but also those people whose jobs might expose them to trauma, such as military and police and emergency services. There's also not just one pattern in terms of the way that people react or respond following the exposure to trauma. And research has shown us, and in fact there's several different ways that people can function or show changes in their functioning over time. And this research has been done following an event and following up on people months and even years post-exposure. And what we find is that some people will be relatively resilient. So they may have a couple of weeks where they are showing some symptoms, but then they basically bounce back or revert to their normal functioning. Some people may have initial quite pronounced impacts, but then over time they show a natural recovery. Some people show a delayed response where in fact they're okay to start off with, but over time they start to show more and more symptoms. And in fact that's the type of trajectory that we often see in the military and the emergency services and police. And for some people you see this chronic trajectory. So they immediately respond poorly following the trauma exposure and never really recover or resolve from that. One thing to note is across all of these different trajectories, one of the things that we do see is this whole idea of post-traumatic growth. So for some people, even though they may have been exposed to something which was really terrible and something that they found very difficult, they can still see and talk about the things that they found that were positive out of that event, that they found that they grew personally, or they learned something about themselves, that they found they had a resilience perhaps that they didn't know about. Important thing to note about these different trajectories is why it's so important that you keep following up on people at different times following a traumatic event. If we only just check in with people in the weeks or even months following a traumatic event, we potentially will miss capturing people who may have impacts which come out several months or even several years post the event. The types of changes that we see in the short term tend to come across these four domains of either mental or cognitive, the emotional, the behavioural, or the physiological. People can show these, symptoms across all four of these domains. Most people won't show all of them, and they might show them at different intensities. And what we find is that for most people, naturally they will start to get better and start to resolve and recover from these symptoms in the weeks or even months following exposure to trauma. And then they will do so through their normal coping strategies and through accessing their normal support networks. Without going into too much detail about the brain, we just don't have time to do it. We do know that exposure has an impact upon the brain, and for some people it can have a longer term impact. There's two major parts of the brain which are being impacted in terms of a exposure to trauma. The prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So the prefrontal cortex here at the front of our brain is the bit that helps us to be rational, to make good decisions, to look at the pros and cons, to try to be rational in how we're looking at issues and to not just be impulsive. But the limbic system is that far more older part of our brain and very much tied to the survival. So doing those things that help us to survive, the things like fighting and fleeing and feeding and mating. So there's things that help us to survive as a human race. And when we're exposed to stress or a trauma, it's the limbic system that really kicks in. So if you think about the fight, flight, or freeze response, that's really your limbic system taking over at times of stress or trauma. And for some people, what can happen, and particularly if it's a really dramatic or traumatic situation, or if someone keeps being exposed to something which is traumatic, basically the limbic system starts to take over, and it almost hijacks the brain and hijacks situations. And it can do that in the face of not just real threat, but also perceived threat or reminders of the trauma. And what happens is that the prefrontal cortex can lose energy or even become sort of offline and start to not be functioning in the same way. So people become very reactive and very emotional and impulsive in terms of how they are reacting. And the types of things that we see across our brain and across our cognitive domain that can be diminished or impacted when someone has been affected by a trauma are things like our memory and our attention. So you get this bias towards attending to things which are associated with the event. So potential traumas. We get this arousal is always up, that you get these things like the startle response, feeling agitated or anxiety, and this impacts our ability to learn. Our executive functioning's impacted, so our ability to do emotional regulation drops. It also impacts upon our problem-solving functioning. We start to become a bit fuzzy in the brain. We get overwhelmed by lots of different pieces of information, and it also impacts upon our ability to to learn new things, and even to access clear memories. There's lots of longer term impacts that we can see in terms of trauma exposure. We often talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but that's in fact just one of the mental health conditions that we can see. We're just as likely to see things like depression and anxiety, generalized anxiety disorders, for example, and substance abuse. We also often will see these chronic feelings of negative emotions, or things like shame and guilt and grief, an inability to access some of those more positive feelings such as happiness and a feeling of hope. As I talked about before, there's this difficulty in managing extreme emotions, and sometimes people will resort to things like substance abuse or self-harm to try to mitigate or control those very negative feelings and emotions. We might see difficulties in terms of interpersonal relationships, whether they be at work, at home, or socially. And then unfortunately what we can see is this knock-on effect in terms of things like maintaining employment, maintaining those important relationships, increasing instances of social disadvantage. And so there's this whole sense of it's not just about mental health impacts that we see, but it's the whole quality of life and how you feel about yourself and how you interact with other people. Sometimes we see increased risk-taking behaviours, so that might be in terms of driving too fast, taking substances that we shouldn't be taking, risky sexual behaviours. And just that whole sense of undermining a sense of being in control, a sense of feeling physical or psychological safety, your sense of efficacy and self-esteem. So those longer term impacts can be felt across all types of domains across someone's well-being and their general functioning. As I said, post-traumatic stress disorder is just one of those consequences that we can see. But just to touch upon it really briefly, there's sort of three key areas that we see changes in. So first of all, there can be avoidance. So people can actively avoid any reminders of the particular trauma. So that they might do that through withdrawal, through avoiding particular people or activities or things that remind them. They may withdraw from other people. They may use substances to try to help them to forget or try to sleep. We see this arousal, this anger, this irritability, always feeling vigilant, watching what's going on around them. The physiological responses are always being activated. So you get this anxiety, you get poor sleep, you get people who are really agitated and taking risks, and you get this change in their thinking, seeing that the world is unsafe or threatening, negative beliefs about themselves and their capacity, and poor concentration or memory. Just like to briefly highlight two complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is really what we see being associated with more chronic forms of trauma, and in particular things like family violence, people who perhaps are asylum seekers or have been exposed to trauma, and also people who've been exposed to childhood neglect or sexual abuse or any type of abuse. And so you see all the things that you see in PTSD, but you also really see the severe and pervasive problems in affect regulation, so the ability to control their emotions, really persistent negative views about themselves, feelings of being defeated and worthless, deep pervasive feelings of shame or guilt or failure, and pervasive difficulties in sustaining relationships and in feeling close to other people. Okay, so using all of that as just a reminder about trauma and its impacts upon people, I'd now like to just start to talk about what are trauma-informed care principles. So trauma-informed care is one of those concepts which has been around for a long time, but hasn't necessarily been really well defined, or there isn't just this one definition which is used across the field. The one that we use was come up with is Hopper and colleagues back in 2010 in the work that they were doing with people who were homeless. And really it's this whole idea that any individual or an organisation which is working with people who've been impacted by trauma, that there really has to be a good understanding of the impact of trauma, how it impacts upon individuals, and how do we use strength-based framework which assists the individuals to help those people who've been trauma impacted. And it's done across a particular model. And these are the key principles that we use, and this is the one that we use at Phoenix, Australia. So these principles, and the first one is being trauma aware, which is just what we've done, this whole idea of needing to have an understanding of what is trauma and what are the impacts upon individuals, not just at the time, but how they can be pervasive and impact individuals, sometimes for individuals across the course of their lifetime. To be promoting that sense of safety, so not just physical safety, but also psychological safety for individuals, a sense that there is some predictability, that they have some type of control, that they are in a safe space, that we're helping people to also be rebuilding that sense of control, that they do have a say, that they do have control over what is happening, that they do have an ability to make some decisions, and that they can affect things which are going to have positive changes in their life. As I said, this is very much a focus on the strengths, so helping people by identifying what are their strengths, what are the things that they have available to them, how do they build on those strengths, what are the coping strategies that they might have, which are the ones that perhaps they've used previously that have had a place in their life that perhaps are not working so well for them, and also then looking at things like how do you help them with building new strategies and skills with a future focus to be able to look at future issues and how do they better deal with those? Promoting connections, what are the connections that they have in their life and how do they build on those? And sometimes that's about looking at where the gaps are. And then the final one, belief in recovery, is in fact a principle that we added on as part of the training that we do, but very much this whole idea that a belief that people can recover or can have positive outcomes in their life, even though they may have been impacted by trauma, and maybe they may have been very significantly impacted by that trauma. And it's a belief that is not just had by the individuals who've been impacted, but also a belief by those people who are working with them, that these people can have positive outcomes and there can be opportunities for recovery. And of course, doing this all in a environment which avoids re-traumatization. Even if at times there are instances where you might need to be discussing or exploring with them their trauma, how do you do that in a way that is respectful and is going to minimize the impact of future harm for them or further harm? So let's have a think about some of the key ways that you can use trauma-informed principles with your clients or within your organisation. And probably worth just highlighting here that, that there's a lot to cover in terms of all of this. I can't cover all of it in just a short presentation. So really all I'm going to be talking is about some of those key tips and strategies that you might be able to use. So first of all, one of the key things that you can be doing is to be thinking about this before you even start to engage with clients. So having established procedures and policies is part of your organisation, and making sure that you know what they are and that you fully understand them. So they might be to do with things like confidentiality, what information it is that you are gathering, what happens to that information, having a clear sense of who you could be or should be referring someone onto, knowing how to do that. Having a really clear sense about what your role is and especially what the limits or the boundaries are so that you can clearly, when you're introducing yourself or when you're engaging someone, be really clear about what those boundaries are. And also being really clear before you start, knowing what is the information that you need to receive from the individual, but also what's the information that you need to give to them. This helps you to plan the engagement, to be making sure that it's straightforward and unambiguous, and also in terms of the information that you need to receive, making sure that you're only asking the questions that you need to ask, and that you can be really clear about why you're asking those questions, so that you're able to explain to the individual where you fit in the process, what your role is, why you need to know the things that you need to know, and therefore why you might be asking particular questions and what it is that you might be able to do to assist that person. So having a really clear sense before you even start to engage, what are the policies and the procedures? Is there any particular training or preparation that you need to do? And perhaps even having to think about how you might engage or describe your roles and your boundaries before you start to do that. So remembering one of those principles is how do you make sure that the client feels safe, and in particular we're talking about here their psychological or their emotional safety. And some of the tips and tricks that you can use include making sure that you have a nice and clear introduction about yourself and about your role. Just feeding into the previous slide, one that perhaps you've really had to think about, and that you're able to clearly state what your role is and where it fits into the bigger organisation. That whole idea of listening actively, making sure that you are paying attention to what this person is telling you about themselves and their experiences and their needs. And of course, active listening means not just listening to what it is that they're saying, but what it is that they're communicating by what they're not saying, or what their body language is saying to you, or the way that they're speaking to you. Being clear and direct in terms of how you are talking to someone. Again, if we think about all the impacts of trauma that may have occurred for this particular client, and I'll keep talking about this, the whole idea of making sure that we're not cognitively overloading someone who in fact might find it hard to process lots of new pieces of information. So what you want to be doing is to be clear and direct in terms of what it is that you're saying, breaking information down into nice, clear, small chunks of information which are easy to digest, being consistent, making sure that you're really clear about what it is that that you can provide and what you can't provide, and being really clear about what the boundaries are. What is your role? What is outside of your role? And being really clear about this whole idea of your work context, and then being the client in terms of your relationship with them. Some of those things that I've just mentioned about being clear and direct, short phrases and sentences, always trying just to make one point at a time. And again, what you might find is useful is that you might be wanting to clarify. So if there's really important pieces of information, you may want to make sure that they're understanding what it is that you've said to them. You might be wanting to also be making sure that you're understanding what they're saying to you. So all those normal tips and tricks that we use in terms of paraphrasing or repeating back what someone might say to you. Asking one question at a time, giving them time to process and to answer that question, trying to say precisely what you mean, and also answering honestly, especially when you don't know something. You want to be building trust and keeping someone's trust. If they get the sense that perhaps you are not being as upfront as you can be, or pretending to know something, or promise something that you can't promise, that is going to undermine potentially some of that trust that you've just built up with them. As I've said, you're trying to be consistent. Deliver as promised, whenever you possibly can. And as we know, that can be really hard to do. So, you know, one of the things to be cautious of is perhaps not trying to talk about something as being a guaranteed promise. That you do need to be really careful about when you're giving time frames, or when you're talking about particular outcomes, that you're being realistic as to what they might be. You know, don't promise what it is that perhaps you can't deliver, or might be outside of your remit or boundaries of what you can deliver. Being really clear about where you need to delegate or to refer on to. And sometimes that can be difficult to do. When we think about people who perhaps find it hard to trust someone, that they have difficulties with interpersonal relationships, and if this is someone that you have found that you've created a good relationship with, that they seem to trust you, that they seem to have opened up to you, referring on can feel really difficult, and needs to be done sensitively. And there's ways that you can do that in terms of being really clear about why you might be referring on, and again, linking it back to how you've described your role, being really clear about what it is you can deliver and can't deliver, what are the boundaries of what it is that you're doing. Perhaps thinking about trying to do a warm transfer or handover, and talking to the person and giving them choice about who it is that you would be referring them onto and how it is that you would be doing that. And wherever possible, following up with that person if you can, to see whether or not, you know, the perhaps what you've talked about, or where you've referred them on to, whether that's been useful to them, whether or not they've been able to follow up with those particular services. So what it is that you're doing is that you're being consistent about your role and your boundaries, and you're following up to see that referral has worked without having had to take on that responsibility yourself. In terms of providing a sense of control, there's several ways that you can do that. For example, when you're getting information, going back to that idea, making sure the client knows why you are asking that information, particularly if you're having to ask information that perhaps they've already given to other people, and that may be someone else within your organisation that they've felt they've already had to give that information to. So being really clear about why you might be asking for information again, but also giving the client some control over that process, stating that they can refuse to give information, giving them a sense of control and a sense of choice over the way that they give that information or that they communicate with you. So for example, asking them, in terms of the way that we continue to communicate, what's your preferred way? Is there a preferred time of day? Some people find it's much easier to do these types of things at the beginning of the day, to get them over and done with, for example, where some other people will say, I do not function well at all in the morning. It takes me a couple of hours to get going. I'd much prefer to be giving information or to be having those phone calls or to be making contact in the afternoon. Ask these questions, work out their preferences, and give them some type of choice about that communication. Ask them whether or not it is that they would prefer to be doing it face to face, whether they'd prefer to be doing it over the phone, whether they would be preferring to do it over emails. If you're going to be providing follow-up information, what's the way that they'd like to get that? Is that they like handouts, if they'd like it to be emailed to them? Wherever possible, always ask a question and let the individual make a choice and give you that their decision. What you're doing is you are providing with them with a sense of control. We know that people who've been impacted by trauma often feel that they don't have that sense of control, that they don't have a sense of being able to build their efficacy where they get to make some choices. And what you're trying to do is to encourage, facilitate them to be able to have choice, to make decisions. Ask them about access to support. Who are their family and friends? What are the services that they're already linked into? What do they find useful? What would they like to perhaps explore? One of the things that I talked about previously, that it may be that what you're doing is trying to work out for them in a non-judgmental way. What are the strategies and the coping strategies that they've used previously that perhaps have worked for them, that have helped to help them to get through things which have been really difficult? And some of them may be ones that we wouldn't see as being the most adaptive, things like using alcohol or substances, and being able to talk to them about what place those coping strategies might have in their current life and in their future, and talk to them about whether or not they would be willing to look at different ways of coping strategies, or perhaps if some of those coping strategies have outlived their usefulness for them. And always encouraging the person to take their time, remembering the impacts that this can have on their ability to concentrate, to think clearly, to problem solve, giving them the space and time to make some decision, to process information, can be really important. And that may mean that you don't do it all in one session, that you might be doing things in quite small chunks. Again, giving them choice, asking what their preference might be. Providing advice and matching it to their capacity, and having an understanding of what their goals are, asking what they're hoping to get out of this, what it is that they're hoping that you may be able to assist them with. What are their goals? Wherever possible, asking for clarification, making sure you have an understanding of what their needs are and what their goals are. As I said, that can be through paraphrasing and asking for new information. Supporting them by giving them information about self-management, things that they can be doing to assist them to make decisions and to do better self-care and look after themselves, and always, wherever possible, giving them some sort of choice. One of the techniques that you can use, for example, so we know that sometimes it can be pretty overwhelming for someone to be generating some ideas. So you might ask them about what it is that they'd like to do, or what their options might be. And what you might find is that some clients really can't think of any, and they become a bit overwhelmed. So in terms of supporting them through this process while still giving them choice, one of the things that you might say, for example, is that I have some clients who are in similar situations to you, and they've talked about some processes or some strategies that they've found useful for them. Would you like me to tell you about some of those? So what you're doing is that you're giving them a choice. They can say, no, thank you, I'm not interested in what other people do. Or if they are interested, you can start exploring with them, or telling them about different strategies or techniques that other people have found useful. One of the strongest research findings that we have in terms of recovery and resilience during or following exposure to trauma is the importance of social support and connections. We know that people can be surrounded by support, but they need to have at least one or two people that they genuinely feel connected to, that they can get practical and emotional support from. This is incredibly important in terms of people being able to recover from or to be able to be resilient in terms of traumatic situations. If you have a bit of time with someone, one of the things that I find is really useful is to do a activity like this one, where you really get them to come up with a bit of a social map. If you just say to people, who are the people who can help you out, it can be difficult for individuals to really generate who those people might be. What it can be useful to do is to really break down all those different people in your life, and what is the role that they might have. Um, and those people won't all have the same role. So, for example, you might have people who can help you with practical things. Who's the person that helps you when something goes wrong in the house and the drain gets blocked, for example, or your car breaks down? Try and identify who are those people who can give you practical assistance. Who are the people you can share your experience with? Who are the people that you trust, that you really feel understand you, that you are willing to sit with and you trust enough to talk to about what's been happening for you? Who are the people you like to spend social time with? We don't necessarily want to have a deep and meaningful a conversation with, but you just want to relax and hang out with and spend some time with and have a relaxing time with. Who are those people that you have important relationships with that you'd like to strengthen? So perhaps relationships which have been really important to you that perhaps aren't as strong as that they should be or you'd like them to be. So is it that perhaps that there's a sibling or a close friend that you've fallen out with that you'd like to rebuild that relationship with? Who are the people that you can help and support? This whole idea that social support shouldn't just be one way; it should be directional. So, who are the people and things that are important to you that you can assist with? And sometimes for people, it won't even be a person; it might be a pet that they really care about, and that's the thing that is really important in terms of their sense of responsibility. And who are the people who can help with advice and problem solving? And they may be external agencies as well. By helping someone to go through this map, what you can do is to assist them to identify not just where they do have people and to be able to name those people or services, but to be able to importantly identify where those gaps are. And then this can be a way that you can start to look at, well, how can we work together to identify ways of filling in those gaps? And one of the things I just like to highlight is that whole idea of promoting hope. And hope can be really engendered through doing all the things that I've just spoken about, always being mindful of the impact of trauma upon individuals, and working with them in ways that help to promote a sense of control and safety and promote social connections. Looking at, what are the immediate needs of this individual, helping them to prioritize what those needs are, and coming up with concrete ways in terms of how they can be helping to meet their own needs, but also the services and other social support networks that can also help them to meet those immediate needs. Identifying and helping them to address what those barriers might be, looking at problem solving strategies, working with them to break those problems down into concrete and achievable steps in terms of being able to solve them, and linking to the appropriate services and support. Again, fostering that idea that it's never going to generally be just one service or support that provides or assists them with all of those needs, but it might be a system or a network of different agencies or individuals or social networks that may assist them. And finally, I'd just like to highlight that we see trauma-informed care as really being bi-directional responsibility between an individual and the organisation that you work for. So the types of things that your responsibilities are understanding what those policies and procedures are, that you develop and practice and reflect upon your skills, that you learn, that you continue with your professional development, that you're always reflecting on what it is that you're doing and how perhaps you could be improving those things, making use of supervision, peer supervision, but also being really actively responsible for your own self-care. Have a plan. Be accountable for your self-care. Certainly what we know is that the best way that of problem solving is to have a plan and breaking it down into achievable goals. The same thing goes for our self-care. And finally, making sure you have a really clear sense of what your boundaries are and keeping within those boundaries. And then conversely, on the other side, the organisation has a responsibility for having clear policies and procedures, for providing opportunities for ongoing professional development and training, providing opportunities for reflection and team discussions, and also mentoring and supervision, actively supporting self-care and resilience, and having really clear expectations around what the boundaries are and where you might fit in with other bigger service systems or support networks. So as you can see, trauma-informed care are principles that anyone can use who might be working with people who've been impacted by trauma, and that trauma impact may be something which is very new, or it may be something that they've been dealing with throughout their entire life. These are principles that can be used by anyone who's dealing with people with trauma, not just mental health professionals, but all of us, including family members, peer support workers, and non-mental health professionals. If you'd like some more information, you can go to our website in Phoenix, Australia, and also we offer some training in trauma-informed care if you'd like to know some more about it, and develop some more skills and strategies around how you might apply it within your workplace. Thank you very much.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really informative. We've got a lot of questions to get through. So before we start, though, it would be really nice to see where everybody's from. We're going to launch a poll now. So in one word, could you let us know what sector you work in? You should see the poll come up on the right-hand side of your screen. And then when we start getting some results, we're going to put it onto the screen. Okay, can we see where everyone's from? Woohoo! Mental health, drug and alcohol. AOD, disability. Oh, it's really great to have you all here. Psychosocial support, community health, family counselling. Wow, family violence. Oh, it's so good to have you all here. You've got a big audience, Nicole.
That's fantastic.
It's
a great mix of people.
Look, it's still going.
Yeah.
Wonderful university. Oh, great to thank you all for being here. Now, first of all, the number one question was, is there going to be a pre-recording of this webinar? And yes, there definitely will be. It'll be available on at www.emphn.org.au. Then search NEMHSCA and then go to the events page and you'll find the recording, and you'll also find the PDFs to these presentations as well. Okay, so let's start with some questions for you, Nicole. Can we switch to the question Slido and have a look and see what our top question is for Nicole? We'll switch back to the Q&A. Okay. So Nicole, why do some people suggest not talking about a traumatic event with clients? Is talk therapy still relevant for people with trauma backgrounds?
It's a great question. And just to start off with, thanks for all of these questions that are coming through. It shows a real interest and a real knowledge in terms of trauma and mental health and what you're seeing in terms of your day-to-day working with people. And really what I've been able to give you is just to whet your appetite in some ways. It's a huge topic. So some of these questions I won't be able to answer in a great deal of detail, but I'll try to give some sort of pointers about the information. Talk therapy is absolutely still relevant. People need to talk about what's happened to them, but they need to do it in a time and a place and with a person that they feel safe with. So making someone talk about it, or compelling them to, or making them feel as if they have to, when you're not the person that they feel comfortable with, or it's not the right time, or it's not the right place, that is against the principles of trauma-informed care. But more and more, the research is telling us how important it is for people to be able to start to talk about what's happened to them and to be able to process it, but to do it in a way which is safe, with people who can understand their reactions, and can help them to moderate how they might be reacting to their, those memories and talking about those things. So that's why we might say to people, talking about it has to be at the right time with the right person. So that's why there might be some cautions about it. It's not that talking about it is something that we would discourage.
Okay. Oh, no, that's great. Thank you so much. And just touching on that, another question that came up was about the guidelines, the new guidelines that Phoenix Australia will be releasing. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Phoenix Australia has been leading the production of the Australian guidelines for acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And we've been doing that ever since the first guidelines, which were released, I think it was 2003. And tomorrow, Minister Hunt will be the Federal Minister for Health, will be releasing the very latest version of those guidelines. And so we'll be able to put up the link for you for those guidelines. And they are what we call a living guidelines. So previously, what we've done is that, you produce a handbook which becomes static for the next 5 years until you update them, regardless of what new evidence is coming out. So the guidelines is all about, in terms of what is aligned with evidence-based best practice, so what we're seeing in the research, and these are very much looking at internationally as well as nationally, going across the world, what's the best research telling us in terms of, for most people, psychological therapies, pharmacological therapies, and other types of therapies, which are the ones that have the best evidence about what seems to work, what are the things that have some emerging evidence, and what are the things that we think are doing something, but we need more research on, and what are the things that don't have enough evidence at this stage. So they're really important guidelines to be having a look at. Wherever possible, of course, what we want to be able to do is we know it's hard to get people into treatment. We know it's hard to get people to stay in treatment. So wherever possible, it's really important to be trying to give them the treatment which has the best chance of doing something which is going to affect a change for them, which is why we advocate for evidence-based treatment wherever possible.
Oh, that's so fantastic. And I suppose really poignant that we're doing this webinar today, and then we'll get the guidelines tomorrow.
Great timing.
So what we might do then is we'll put the guidelines onto the website. So it's www.emphn.org.au, and hopefully we should get them tomorrow or the next day, but we'll get them on there. We'll get them on for everybody.
As soon as they've been launched by the Minister, the link will become available and I'll be able to pass that on.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, let's do another question. Let's switch the Slido. Okay. Great question. Are breathing and grounding techniques equally as beneficial? What other techniques can we use with clients if we are not trained therapists?
Okay, so in terms of things like breathing and grounding techniques, they're very fundamental techniques that anyone can use with someone that they're working with. And in fact, the training courses that we do around trauma-informed care or psychological first aid, they're very basic skills, and they're training courses that anyone can do. You don't need to be a mental health professional to do. And in terms of when you're working with someone and you're trying to reduce physiological and psychological distress and bring someone back to the here and now, to switch off that automatic response that you get, the fight, flight, freeze response. One of the first things that we might teach people to do is to do a simple breathing exercise with someone, or get them to mindfully think about where they are, so to do some type of grounding exercise with them. So they're really important techniques to be able to learn. They're not hard techniques to be able to learn, but it's also really important that what you're doing is that you're monitoring how they're working for that individual. So for whatever reason, for that individual, it might be that trying to do some type of exercise with them, it might be something that activates a negative response for them. So sometimes a breathing exercise may not be the best thing to be working with a client to do. So what you might be doing with them instead is getting them to think about, something like a SUD scale, so a subjective units of distress scale, and to be able to start to talk about or identify other things that change within themselves, things that they notice about how they're feeling or their physiological responses, etc., and getting them to think about, well, what are the things that you do to move yourself up and down that different scale. So being a trauma-informed person is all about making sure that you're working with that individual, that you as a person who's working with those types of clients, you have lots of things in your toolkit. You go out and you learn different techniques, and when you're working with a client, you're very responsive to what their needs are. You're being guided with them about what they're interested in learning. You ask questions like, what techniques have you used previously? What has someone else used with you previously? What worked? What didn't work? What did you like? What didn't you like? So very much getting their feedback in the here and now, which is one of those things, when you're teaching breathing exercises or you're talking to someone about them, it's always a great idea to practice with them and go through it with them, because you can see if they're finding a difficulty, or if they're having some type of negative reaction to it.
Thank you so much. All right, well, let's have a look at another question. Oh, another great question. Could you speak to trauma-informed principles via phone, please, specifically as we're in the midst of pandemic measures?
Yeah, great. I think that most of us had to do a fairly quick change in terms of some of the ways that we manage people. But the reality is that lots of people provide psychological first aid and trauma-informed care over the phone. We think about Lifeline, these self-help, these helplines that people access. So, you're getting less information from the individual, and wherever possible, if you can get the person, if they have the ability to perhaps video conference, that can be a good thing to be suggesting to them. But the reality is that you're still asking questions, you're still doing the things about giving them the same information about who you are and what your boundaries are, that you're giving them choice around how they're receiving information. And it may be that it becomes more important about asking, how do you provide that follow-up information for them? Can I email you something? Can I send you something? So it's still asking the questions from the individual. What does this person need? What are the circumstances for this individual? And how best can I work with them to meet their needs? And if it is that you've had a relationship with this client and you're suddenly having to go from face to face to over the phone, it can be really useful to talk to them about the differences, to ask them how they're finding it, if they're finding that there are particular barriers or the things that they don't like about it. One of the things that some of the clinicians that I speak to have noticed is that when someone comes into your office, often there's or you're meeting a client somewhere, there's a bit of a lead up. Someone, when they're coming to see you, has had a bit of time to think about that they're coming to see someone to talk about what's going on for them. They might sit in a waiting room for a period of time. There's a bit more of a lead in and a warm up to the session. So sometimes you need to be making sure that you're giving them a bit of time still, even though you're on the phone, to settle into the session, even though you might be doing it remotely.
That's great. And I really love that part of your presentation, when you talked about giving people choice and control. And sometimes that's even just in the referral process or when you first meet a person. And I suppose the same goes for over the phone as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much. All right. Well, let's have a look at another question. How do we support an individual that disassociates as a consequence of trauma?
Yeah. So disassociation is where someone loses touch with reality, so that they don't really feel like they're in the here and now, that they don't feel that they're grounded in the here and now. So that's where we would use some type of grounding activity with them. So can be really simple, just in terms of, some of the ones that I like to use is just get them to think about where they are in terms of their senses. Can you describe to me 2 things that you can see? Can you describe to me 2 things that you can hear? What about 2 things that you can feel? Can you describe to me what you can see? I want you to look out your window and I want you to describe to me in detail what it is that you can see. So, it's really about them trying to think about what I can see, what I can hear, what's going on for me, because when someone's dissociated, they've lost themselves in a memory or in a flashback of something, feeling as if something that's happened to them previously is happening in the here and now. Often people think that this is going to happen more often than it does. Having someone dissociate is not as common as sometimes I think people think that it will be, but absolutely these simple grounding techniques are really effective. And sometimes one of the things I like to do is you might get them to do a grounding exercise, and then you might follow that up with a breathing exercise. So because they've dissociated and they've been reminded of something, even though you might have brought them back to the here and now, they might be still quite agitated. And particularly if you're doing a breathing exercise where someone's doing something like counting or saying a word like relaxation as they're going, really what you're doing, it has the double edge of being a breathing exercise, but also a grounding exercise at the same time, because you're forcing them, you're guiding them to be thinking about the here and now and to be in the present.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, well, let's have a look at another question. I commonly get the response, no one, or I don't have anyone like that. How would you respond to this? And I think that's talking about a support network or a support person.
Yeah. So, and I'm presuming that probably came in after we did the social network map. I find that map is a really powerful tool, but you do have to be careful when you're presenting it to someone, because you can get a situation where each time you go, and what about someone like this? Who could you talk to, or who's someone you could hang out with, or who's someone who could help you with practical support? Sometimes people can be quite negative and go, no one, got no one, I've got no one. And it may be that what you're then using that for is an opportunity to do some problem solving. Again, asking the person, okay, so it seems to be that one of the areas that we could work on would be, how do we start to look at filling out this social support map? Is that something that you'd be interested in working with? Remember that principle of giving them a choice. And then to be problem solving with them. Well, which one do you think would be most important to you? Which one do you think we should be tackling first? Which one would you be most interested in tackling first of all? And it might be that you're already, so in terms of getting practical support or someone who can give you emotional support, it may be that you're helping them by looking at, well, who are the support services? So the fact that you're talking to them and you've engaged in them with this relationship is that, in fact, you can be saying, well, we have this, I can be providing some support to you. And in doing that, we can start to build some other people into that map also. So it can be a really powerful tool for starting to look at, well, here are the gaps, and let's start to problem solve. Let's start to see what you would be interested in doing in terms of trying to fill out some of those gaps. And sometimes what you're doing is you're giving them, it might be that you're looking at support networks or support groups that they could be joining, where they might start to meet other people who are in a similar situation, where they might be able to create more of a social network.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. I think we've probably got enough time for one more question. Can we have that one up? Okay. Can you provide some insight relating to people who experience trauma and difficulties relating to stages of change, that I'm feeling a bit stuck change?
Yeah, so I guess that in terms of whenever we're working with someone who is a little bit stuck, is that it is about working with them to perhaps talk about why it is that they're stuck in that particular stage. And again, trying to be trauma informed about what is it they want out of this? What are their needs? What are their immediate needs at this point in time? And sometimes it might be about breaking down what the next stage might be and how they might get to the next stage. It's the classic thing of the next goal might look really big or really scary, but if you start to break it down to if that's something that we're aiming for, that you would like to make a change, how do we start to break that down into something that we can be working together in chunk sizes? Again, is that something you'd like us to do? What in terms of let's problem solve what some of those options might be, and you can then choose which is the one that you would be most interested in doing.
Yeah.
So it's that classic thing of helping them to come up with a way of being able to do something which is achievable for them. When we know that often people who have a trauma history get overwhelmed very easily. The whole idea of wanting some stability means that sometimes they'll allow themselves to be stuck in an area because that's less scary, even though they might not be happy where they are. That seems less overwhelming than having to change somewhere. And I would also really encourage each of you, this is the importance of supervision for yourself also, because sometimes working with people who seem very stuck, sometimes you need to be able to talk to other people, workshop, or brainstorm some different ways of and different options that you might give to this person to help them move forward.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much. So I think that's probably all the questions we can answer with you today, Nicole.
Great.
But I was just wondering if you could speak quickly about Phoenix Australia and just how people could access your training and what's available.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of people did put, I think, a question about referring people in. So we don't provide direct clinical services as such. We do run a clinic where we do research trials for different types of trauma. And if it's Melbourne based, but if you think that you have a client that might be suitable for, go and have a look at our website. The main things that we'll provide is the treatment through the clinic. We also provide a lot of training, so things like trauma informed care. So normally I'd give this training as a whole day training course, psychological first aid, trauma focused therapy for adults or children, the neurobiology of trauma, anger and trauma. So there's a whole series of them. With a caveat, at the moment, of course, in the COVID environment, there are restrictions on what training we can be doing. Right at this very moment, we have a couple of courses which are online. So trauma informed care and psychological first aid. Which were done basically videoed in, recorded in my living room. So at the moment, we're right in the process of doing the next versions of those. So they will be available probably in the next 6 weeks or so. And that's a really good way to do that type of training very flexibly. And it's a full day's training course that you can do in a self-paced format. So I would suggest, if you're interested in that, then keep your eye out for those when they come out.
Oh, thank you so much, Nicole.
No,
so if you just hang on, Nicole, we might just do a final poll before we say goodbye to you. So we've got a little poll there. We wanted to ask you how you found the trauma informed care presentation and the Q&A. So why don't you take a moment to answer that, and we can watch it all live on screen. That's great. This is so great, this live part of the process, because, we can't see everybody. We can't, hear from you, but we can see through this polling. It's really great. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Well, I'm going to introduce our next speaker now. So Kim Robinson from Northern CASA is a senior advocate and counsellor. And I will see you after her presentation for some Q&A with Kim.
Hi there, my name is Kim and I'm a counsellor advocate for the Northern Centre Against Sexual Assault, and I'm really pleased to be part of this presentation today, if a little daunted by doing my first webinar. My presentation today is going to focus on enabling support workers within the mental health and community services sector to more confidently respond to clients and consumers who have experienced sexual abuse, either as a child or as an adult. As I understand it, there's going to be space at the end of the webinar for questions, so please jot down any questions that arise for you as we go through. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respect to these people, their culture and their traditions. And I pay particular respect to their elders, past and present, and to any other Aboriginal people here today. Just an overview of what I'm going to be presenting today. I'm going to look at the definition of sexual assault, a bit about the prevalence and the impacts of sexual assault, a brief introduction to the counselling approach by Northern CASA, and also a bit of the trauma lens that we use. We're looking at the barriers for clients in disclosing the issue of sexual abuse in their lives, as well as principles for responding to disclosures. Also look at some unhelpful responses, but also how to support workers and practitioners to create a safe context for sexual assault disclosure. And then also some of the referral pathways for Northern CASA. I'd just like to acknowledge that the issue of sexual violence can impact all of us, either personally or through family or obviously our workplace. And so it's important to take note of your response to this presentation at both an emotional and felt body sense. Seek support, input if you need to. Please be kind and gentle to yourself. So the definition of sexual assault that we adopt at Northern CASA is any behaviour of a sexual nature that makes someone feel uncomfortable, frightened, intimidated or threatened. It's sexual behaviour that someone has not agreed to, or to which the person is not capable of giving consent because they're substance affected, they're mentally unwell, and of course a child cannot give consent. Or also where another person uses physical or emotional force against them. It includes hands-on and hands-off offending behaviours. Examples of hands-off offending behaviours could refer to being coerced to watch pornography, being leered at, receiving unwanted sexting messages. Important to notice that our definition of sexual assault differs a little from the legal definition in that some of what we accept as sexual violation is not strictly against the law. For example, sexual harassment. It's important to remind ourselves of how prevalent this issue is in our community and how frequently this may underlie or contribute to people's poor mental health or other complex issues in their lives. So whether or not your clients disclose to you an experience of sexual abuse from their past or recent sexual abuse, there's no doubt you'll be working with people who are exhibiting some of the impacts of trauma arising from sexual abuse experiences. So these are just some of the impacts of sexual abuse, and you can see that there's potential impacts in all spheres of life. Relationships with others, relationship with oneself, distorted beliefs about oneself, heightened emotional overwhelm, behavioural changes, sometimes physical injuries, and some of the PTSD symptoms, heightened activation, avoidance, reactivities to any reminders associated with the abuse. And of course, there are also the compounding impacts that can occur when victim survivors encounter negative attitudes and disbelief around their disclosure. It's a kind of re-traumatisation. Imagine someone finally telling their parent or an important person in their life about the sexual abuse by their uncle or their friend or their father, and the response being one of minimising or even disbelief. That would be devastating and, of course, very silencing for someone. So this tree illustrates our conceptualisation of the theoretical approaches drawn on in our work at Northern CASA. Safety and stabilisation are key starting points. And the tree roots represent the 4 key pillars that underpin our model. And central to our practice approach are the core principles of belief, choice and control. And then we draw on other practice frameworks to broadly guide and inform our counselling work. And then we have a range of therapeutic approaches which we may utilise depending on our own sort of professional backgrounds and skills and experience. All of these components aim to ensure our work with clients remains centred on their needs and embedded in an understanding of trauma and are ones that are hopefully empowering for the client. It also endeavours to recognise that sexual assault exists in a social context which encompasses different social and economic relationships and power imbalances between women and men, adults and children, and other intersectional relationships. I'm sure you've all heard the idea that sexual abuse is about an abuse of power. So this slide tries to bring in even more complexity relating to the nature and extent of the trauma, the state of the person's social world and their attachment and developmental experiences, and what all those different variables might mean for the resultant impacts of the sexual abuse trauma. For example, a single traumatic event by a stranger perpetrated against someone with stable family and attachment relationships is going to have a different configuration of impacts to someone who experienced a childhood of repeated sexual abuse from a close, trusted family member, perhaps in a family context already fractured and emotionally bereft or neglectful. It's probably fair to say that many of our more vulnerable clients are likely to have experiences which lean more towards the right side of each of these spectrums. However, it can also be true to say that a single experience of sexual abuse which may overlay a more complex childhood of emotional neglect or abuse can also be extremely debilitating. So with complex trauma, essentially the person's body and brain can become hardwired to almost anticipate and assume that closeness and intimacy and indeed relationships, people are dangerous. The nervous system has had to adapt around the reality of living with the constant threat of danger and to adapt around the reality that in that person's childhood, closeness and intimacy was dangerous. So this statement encapsulates the impact of childhood trauma in particular and emphasises how responses to danger and threat can be embedded in that person's sort of nervous system. In the words of Deb Dana, who's a trauma specialist, trauma replaces patterns of connection with patterns of protection. The early onset trauma requires the brain to shift its focus from learning to survival and disrupts the neural integration necessary to respond flexibly to daily challenges. The effects of complex trauma on individual functioning are pervasive and deeply disruptive to the key developmental tasks of attachment, self-regulation, and the development of competencies. To just extend your understanding of what I mean by trauma shaping the way a person responds to threat, here is a very simple model of the brain. At the top, as you can see, is the frontal cortex, or the thinking brain. In the middle section is the limbic system, or the emotional brain. And at the base is the most ancient part of the brain that we share with reptiles, which is responsible for things like our heart rate and breathing. And the amygdala, you can see as a star shape, is like a kind of smoke detector for the brain of anything of a threatening nature. So when we speak about trauma being hardwired into someone's nervous system, we're really talking about the amygdala response as having been shaped around early frightening experiences, and in a sense this becoming the new normal for that person's nervous system. So as I mentioned before, sexual abuse trauma occurs in a relational context. And so depending on the nature of the sexual assault, interpersonal events that share some similarities with the original trauma are quite likely to activate that smoke detector, or the amygdala. It's recognising that these indicators show some kind of possible threat. So if a person was assaulted, for example, by a man with facial hair, that person's nervous system is likely to be activated more by men with facial hair. That person can try and call on their thinking brain to tell themselves, hang on, I know this is not the same man. This person is just reminding me of something from the past. I'm not currently in danger. However, the connection between the amygdala and the connection between the working memory and the amygdala there is not so strong. And so sometimes this is not enough to calm a person. Often, a more effective way to calm a person's amygdala, getting it to switch off, is by this idea of turning on the noticing brain. If I ask you to look around the room and notice all the green items in your room, you're turning on the noticing brain. If I ask you to notice your inward and outward breath, in this process of noticing, you're sending a message to your amygdala that the environment is safe and it can switch off. And this is the basis of mindfulness and its capacity to calm a person's nervous system. So I guess I wanted to do a brief exercise to demonstrate the link between adopting a trauma framework and what that might mean we do in practice in the room with clients. So this is what we would refer to as a grounding activity, which we may do with a client who's beginning to feel overwhelmed or who wants a strategy to manage overwhelm at other times in their lives. So I'm going to get you to just take a moment, and if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, and just feel your feet on the floor. Feel the floor pushing up underneath your feet. Noticing your body in the chair. Again, noticing the places on your body that are connecting with the chair. And now just bringing your awareness to your inward and outward breath. Just noticing. Noticing the movement of your chest up and down. And I'm just going to get us to intensify that a little bit. I'm going to invite you to hold your breath and just at the top of the breath count to 5. And then I'm going to get you to release a third of your breath, count to 4, another third, count to 4, and then just breathe normally. So in the room with someone, I might get them to do that 1 or 2 times, just to get them to do it themselves. And now I just want you to take a moment to notice that how that lands in your nervous system. So, what do we endeavour to do in our role as counsellor advocates? We endeavour to focus our work with the client on what our client wants to change in their lives. So very much working with them. We understand that working with clients who experience complex trauma can actually be more about helping them feel safe and grounded and settled, like that previous exercise, but also how to bring that more comprehensively into people's lives. We also understand that learning about trauma, psychoeducation, can help clients to make sense of their overwhelming feelings and to gain control over them. In a sense, what we're emphasising is that having a trauma response is actually about having a human response to what was a frightening and overwhelming experience. And we might note that if that overwhelming experience happened as a child, that a lot of these responses are very adaptive to that time. However, they can become embedded and persist in a person's life, even when that person is now an adult. Essentially, we're less interested in the question, what's wrong with you? Rather, we're wanting to understand what has happened to you and how has this affected you. We want to be able to offer validation and understanding in relation to this and work towards the person overcoming the impacts of sexual assault. Remember that, I think this quote from a client captures the essence of what we Northern CASA try and hold on to. It helps us to be grounded in the lived experience of the people that seek our help. Remember that we are here because of what happened to us and not because of what is wrong with us. My emotions might be running wild, but I'm still here and I'm an expert in my life. Instead of telling us what we need, you should ask us what we need. Trauma impacts us as a whole person: physical, mental, financial, spiritual, and social. So before we discuss how to respond to actual disclosures of sexual abuse, it's helpful to consider what does get in the way of someone telling someone else about it, telling a family member or a friend or a support worker. Remember that this abuse more often than not occurred when the person was a child, and so those childhood fears about the consequences of speaking out, of not remaining silent, can often still continue to play out. Fear of not being believed, shame, feeling that they were to blame. So they can continue to play out even though the person is now an adult. Fears about destroying the family, or of overburdening a friend, or shaming the family. All of these things may have both been originally felt as a child and have continued to act as barriers to the person sharing their experience in the present. Even if the sexual assault has occurred as an adult, there can continue to be many reasons why someone may choose not to potentially expose themselves to judgment, blame, or feelings of shame in telling someone about their experience. So important to understand these things so that we can hold that in our understanding. Sometimes we as workers can also inadvertently convey our own misgivings or fears about hearing about an experience of sexual abuse from our clients. Having someone tell us these things can be difficult, painful, and maybe on some levels we don't really want to hear them. That might be because we don't know how to respond. We might feel out of our depth. We might worry we would say the wrong things or be too invasive, re-traumatize someone. We may have doubts about someone's story. So we need to hold an awareness about this and to deal with our own reservations in this area. This is our issue as workers, and we need to be able to endeavour to provide a safe environment for people to speak about painful things if they want to. And obviously, listening to a presentation like this, which gives you some pointers about how to respond and to build confidence in this area, is hopefully going to help you feel more effective and capable. So, these principles for responding to disclosure align very strongly with trying to counter the barriers to disclosure that we discussed earlier. We obviously want the person to know that they are believed and that we won't judge them. We want them to feel emotionally safe in the moment, but also to check that they feel safe in their lives currently from the perpetrator. We want the person to know that we understand that they are a human being who has reacted to an awful thing that has happened to them, and that their reaction is a very human thing. It's a very normalising comment. We want the person to feel that they can have some control in the telling, in a way which is opposite to the lack of control they experienced when the abuse occurred. We also want to convey that there is some help available if they want it, and that again the control is about who, where, when, in their own time. So here are some of the key elements of responding to and helping with a disclosure. We want to take the disclosure seriously. We want to provide affirmation and validation. We want to just get some clarity about the nature of the sexual abuse. Not real detail, but are we talking about sexual abuse that was historical or recent? Is this the first time they've ever told anyone? Did something in particular happen which triggered a memory? Some clients often have triggers that bring them into a state of disorganisation, destabilisation. For example, a client may have seen the offender in the street, or they might have seen something on telly that kind of brought all this back. Or for some women, having a child that comes to the age at which they were abused can also be quite triggering. We also want to explore, what does a person need? Maybe they just need to tell this and that's all. Or maybe they need more. So they will be able to let you know what they want to do with that. Remember, you have a team around you and the person has chosen you to tell. And so you can be their guide, but be guided by them in turn. Even more, we may want to find ways of signposting to some clients, especially those we have strong working relationships with, that we are able to hear hard stuff and that we're interested to help them find the right kinds of support, obviously only if that person wants to go down that path. So we might try to create the conditions for someone to feel that were they actually to disclose hurtful experiences, that they would get a respectful and empathic response. After all, if someone has a childhood experience which has contributed to their mental health issues in the present, surely it's helpful ultimately if they were to get some support and help around these issues. So you might say something like, sometimes when bad things happen in the present, they touch on bad things that have happened in the past. Is that the case for you? Has anyone ever hurt you or touched you in ways that made you feel frightened or uncomfortable? You know, if you ever decided you wanted to talk about hard stuff, I can help. You can talk to me, and I can help you find the right person. Similarly, supportive comments if someone does share something of an abuse nature to you. What happened to you must have been really frightening. No one should have to go through that. You look really upset. Would it help you to talk some more about this with me? You know, you don't need to tell me any details of what happened, but we could talk about how it's affecting you and what might help you. So I'm sure all of you have made those comments to people around difficulties in their life, and sexual abuse is no different. Obviously, there can be some unhelpful responses. People who have experienced sexual abuse often have a very keen, sensitive radar for detecting if someone doubts them, if someone is minimising what they're saying, or if someone says something that shifts responsibility away from the offender onto the person who experienced the abuse. For example, you know, saying something like, "What were you doing out there that night?" Or, "Why didn't you tell someone earlier?" "Oh, well, it happened a long time ago. Need to focus on the present. Put it behind you." Or, "Oh, let's not open that can of worms." If the victim survivor picks up on these messages, they're quite likely to be quite affected by this. They'll take the message that, okay, this person is not someone I can speak to about this. I can't expect to be understood by this person. So we just need to be mindful about some of the explicit or even implicit messages we can convey by things we might say. And they may be things that we say meaning well meant, but are ultimately counterproductive to creating a safe context for disclosure and for that person to feel heard. So just to finish up, here are some of the voices of some people with sexual abuse experiences. We're people who've had some awful experiences, and we might be really messy right now. But don't give up on us. Don't look at our behaviours, but focus instead on what's driving them. We need you to acknowledge the journey, and the fact that we are still alive and holding on is a testament to our strength. It's hard to convey just how difficult our experiences have been. Your patience and compassion validates us and empowers us to see that change is possible. I felt like an empty shell because your spirit leaves your body when you're abused. It was just a terrible maze, so you shut down, you withdraw, and when you haven't faced what happened to you, you withdraw. If you get support and treatment, your spirit will come back to you. This is how it's been for me. Reclaiming soul, reclaiming spirit. So This is just something about our referral pathways. This is a photograph of Northern CASA at the Austin Repat campus. There is a CASA in most regions, and our core work is offering counselling. We also offer secondary consults to people who are supporting others in the community who have experienced sexual abuse. When you make a referral, we do ask and prefer to speak directly with the person requesting the counselling. In a sense, it's a first step. Coming to counselling around this issue of sexual abuse is a big step for people, and we want to make sure that the person is really on board with this idea. Obviously, you can help facilitate that phone call, and maybe the person might want to sit in the room with you. As you can see, our eligibility criteria is pretty broad. Often our assessment beyond that is about whether we think the referral is appropriate, based more around the concept of being the right time for sexual assault counselling. How mentally stable and or physically safe is the client? Sexual assault counselling is a process really of gently dancing around and toward trying to address extremely painful issues and to understand the impacts on people's life. But even just walking into our service can be highly activating for many clients, and so they need to have sufficient kind of resources really to be able to do that. In our assessment, we're always weighing up the balance between wanting to help the person deal with their underlying issues of sexual abuse whilst not overwhelming their capacity to cope. It makes sense that when people try and deal with issues that they've essentially tried to keep out of the forefront of their minds for a long time, often, it can mean they return to the kinds of coping strategies and distractions which have essentially helped them survive. For example, substance use, self-harming behaviours. We honour those behaviours in the sense that it's helped people stay alive. However, obviously, they can also be dangerous to people, and we don't want to overwhelm people in our work. So assessing this balance is a conversation to have with your clients before going down the path of referral. And in that way, the client is then at least invited to consider the best timing of when to begin this process. Obviously it could be now, but equally it might be some months or even years down the track. And, we are not going anywhere, and people can contact us at any time. So that's all from me for my presentation, and now it's any questions that people might have.
Hi Kim, welcome and thank you so much. That was such a fantastic presentation, and we have so many questions for you. So let's get straight into it.
Sure.
Let's look at the first questions up on Slido. Okay, so Kim, when someone talks about body memories of abuse and says something happened to me, but I don't know exactly who or what, how would you go about proceeding with the counselling?
Well, obviously we go back to those sort of primary principles around responding, and so conveying a sense of belief to the person about their experience, but not necessarily jumping ahead of what the person's describing. So what they have is feelings of body memories and feeling discomfort and feeling a sense that somehow that might have been related to an experience of violation, but they don't know whether that's the case. And I guess we would just be staying in that space because the person doesn't have memories. Maybe those memories will come forward, maybe they won't. We're not in the business of naming something as a sexual assault or a particular abuse experience if that's not the memory that the person actually has. They have a sense of somehow they experienced a violation and they're feeling it at a body memory. And so we just kind of affirm that that's where they're at, and to explore that. Probably if a person has come to a centre against sexual assault, then they've gone one step further themselves and said in their minds, okay, this is a sexual assault, or this is what I think it is. We usually have a conversation with someone at the point of intake, I guess, really to try and tease that out, because I guess sometimes those things are better explored in a more sort of general counselling setting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Kim, we're just getting a bit of feedback from your cord, maybe from your cord, your headphone cord. Do you want to hold it out just a little bit? Yeah, I think that's going to be better. Thanks. Okay, thank you. Let's have a look at another question. Okay, so what is the best way to bring up / raise or / explore suspected sexual abuse with a client?
I guess you're really drawing on the relationship that you're building with the client, a relationship of trust, and you're signposting to the client that you're someone who is going to believe them, who's not going to be judgmental. So the kinds of conversations that you and responses that you've made to other circumstances the client might have been talking to you about are going to be giving that message to the client that perhaps you are a person that's a safe person that they can disclose to. But if you wanted to just really open that door a little bit more, you might just, if something's happened and the client's distressed about something, you might just say, sometimes distress that we experience in the present can connect with other times where we've been hurt or felt misunderstood or where somebody's done something awful to us. Has that been your experience? So I think that something like that response was in the presentation, and you just leave that there. The client may take it up, they may not. But what you're doing is conveying to them that if they choose to share, open up about an experience, then that door is open. And I think, again, we have to respect clients' choice in terms of timing of when they choose to open up about an experience, and lots of things might be determining that.
Yeah, and so you're sort of creating a safe professional relationship in a space that if they do choose to share, then that's their choice as well.
Yeah.
Okay, good, that's great. Let's have another question up on Slido. Okay. How can you respond to a childhood sexual assault survivor who states, "I blame myself. I knew it was wrong, but I still let it happen"?
I think that self-blame for sexual assault is a very common and in some ways a human response to having experienced something really awful. And so what I would do is to sort of normalise that and to kind of say that a lot of people who've experienced hurtful behaviour or who've experienced a sexual assault blame themselves, but I would remind them that they were a child and that they didn't agree to what was happening. So I'd just be reinforcing those ideas around consent and what consent looks like. A child can't consent to any kind of sexual behaviour. And also to point out all the differences in those power relationships. That the adult is the one that has the knowledge about what sex is. The adult is the one that is kind of created a circumstance where they are able to groom that child. There's lots of ways in which that adult is manipulating the situation to enable access to that child, and not to also ensure that the child doesn't speak out. But also, you know, sometimes a child can be speaking out through their behaviour, and often as an adult recalling their childhood, that's not what they're going to remember. They're not going to be remembering the ways in which either the perpetrator was manipulative and groomed not only them but their family for access, but also they're not going to remember the ways in which they tried to, you know, in a sense, resist that abuse, i.e. they might have avoided going down a certain street, or they might have tried to, their behaviour might have demonstrated that they were sort of not things weren't going well with them. So there's lots of ways that they may have actually tried to find their way out of this. And so I guess we would just be having those kinds of conversations to gently help that person to start to consider that maybe they weren't to blame. It's not something you can just tell. I mean, obviously we do say to people, you know, in no way was this your fault. The responsibility sits very much with the person who did this to you. But we also kind of sometimes make the distinction that you can know that up here, but down here it's a much longer process to shift that real sense of somehow I deserve this, or somehow I did something that caused this to happen. So, you know, we just sit with that gently in the counselling space and work to unpack that.
Okay, thank you. So let's put the Slido questions back up. I realise I probably jumped a few down. So the next question is, how do you respond to someone who has disclosed they have not only experienced sexual assault, but also they have been the perpetrator themselves?
Look, I guess it depends on, you know, I don't know the context in which this person is asking this question and the context in which they're working, and how old the person would be who is speaking here. Obviously that has implications, and if it's a present issue, you know, that the offending is still happening, obviously that is also begets a different pathway and different conversation. But let's assume that you're talking with an adult who is reflecting back on their experience of childhood sexual abuse, but then has also disclosed that not only did they experience sexual abuse, but that they also did things that were in violation of, you know, someone else's body. I guess that we're both trying to then hold the space for the victim survivor, but also to invite that person to, I guess, understand their behaviour in the context of that. So also, let's say the abuse was happening when the child was 6, and then the 6-year-old then acted out that behaviour with another child. So that is that is one circumstance that might happen. Or there might be a child who is abused at 6, and then as a young adolescent then engages in problematic sexual behaviour towards another child, which you can see already is more problematic. I mean, not minimising the experience of the 6-year-old abused by another 6-year-old, but in terms of the person that's before you in the room, then that's... So there's lots of nuance to this, and
complicated and complex.
There is,
and everyone's an individual.
It's important to know, to let people know that there is some programs for children if they're under the age of 18 and they exhibit problematic sexual behaviour or abusive sexual behaviours. Then there are programs for young children and young people. In the northern region, it's Kids First. But you know, many of the CARSs have this aspect of the work attached to it. But going back to your question, where I'm assuming it's a person who's an adult now reflecting back on that, I guess, you know, we want to provide some understanding about how that might have occurred, but also we want to invite that person into a space of, you know, owning some responsibility for the choices they made, even if they were themselves a child. So, you know, we are putting some context there. They are a child themselves. Doing this behaviour, and depending on how old they are, again, we kind of adjust our understanding and our the complexity of that towards that. Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
It's a big topic, that one.
Yes, very much, and it seems to be so complex. Well, let's move on. We've got time for a few more questions. Okay, so any tips for working with people who disclose or remember sexual assault when they were psychotic, or maybe having a psychotic episode?
Or
maybe it could be almost about maybe it's a time where they didn't remember or felt that they were out of control of what they were doing.
Yeah. Look, the same principles apply. We believe, affirm, and we respond. If that person, I mean, we do get disclosures of sexual abuse who are currently inpatients in psychiatric wards, and I think years gone by, those disclosures of a sexual assault occurring on the ward were perhaps minimised and overlooked, and I think things are changing in that way, hopefully. But we take it as it is, and that perhaps it's the tip of an iceberg of other experiences in which their experiences weren't validated and were minimised, but the person is currently in distress and the person is currently feeling like they have experienced a violation, and so we work on that basis.
Okay, that's great. Okay, let's have a look at Slido for another question. Can you comment on the complexity of working with the intersectionality of transgender and sexual assault?
I think the first thing to say is that CARSs, and our CARSA in particular, is, you know, we're constantly trying to ensure that our service is as accessible to, you know, people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, and including gender diverse people. And when people come to our service, they come because they've experienced a sexual assault. Now, the circumstances in which that has occurred, or the particular sort of gender identification or the gender of the person who's done that to them, is important in the sense that we, you know, this is an individual who's in our room and we're speaking to their lived experience. So aside from wanting to be respectful around, you know, people's particular identities and affirming of their kind of right to identify how they choose to, we're still going to be applying the same kinds of principles and being as responsive as we can, as well as trying to hold awareness of what other kind of particular supports might be available or that they may not be aware of in the community. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, well, we're just running out of time now, so we wanted to launch just one poll just to give us a bit of feedback about the presentation and the Q&A that Kim has just given you. So we might launch that now. And while we're waiting for your responses, Kim, I was just wondering if you could let us know, how do people contact CASAs in their region? And what can they do? Is it straightforward? Is there one number, or can they go through other means as well?
Yeah. Look, the CASAs are, they're connected in the sense that they're all part of a kind of a larger grouping, but in and of themselves, they are separate services, and so they do all run separately. In the presentation, I noted that we offer a 16-session model of free counselling. Other CASAs may vary in how many sessions they offer, those kinds of things, and also their particular criteria, although generally it'll be around an experience of sexual assault. So probably the best port of call, if you don't know your CASA in your region, is 1-800-RESPECT as a kind of centralised number.
Yeah, and I'll just say for people that the 1-800-RESPECT is 1-800-737-732. Just for people, if you have been impacted or if you'd like to speak to somebody about getting some sexual abuse counselling.
Yeah. And the other approach is just to try Google. Yeah. But obviously all the CASAs have details about the other CASAs catchment. So if you were to call Northern CASA, our intake line, we would send you in the right direction, hopefully.
Thank you so much. Well, let's have a look at the results of the poll. Can we get them up here? Oh, very good. That's great. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for sticking in throughout to the end, because we have been going for 2 hours and it's a long time to dedicate to such, really sensitive and quite intense work and subjects that we've been talking about today. So I want to thank you, Kim, and I want to thank everybody. We've got one more poll that would be so helpful for us. This is our final survey. If we can launch that final survey poll and get your results, that would be great. And other than that, I will say goodbye to you. And yes, please take care of yourself. Practice self-care tonight. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your time and participation. And a special thank you to Nicole and Kim from Phoenix, Australia and Northern CASA. Thank you so much for your incredible time and energy and practice wisdom. I also want to thank the Eastern Melbourne PHN for funding and hosting these webinars on their website. But most importantly, I would like to thank the NEMHSCA Professional Development Working Group for all their time, work and collaborative effort. This group puts on events for the workforce throughout the year using their in-kind time, their support, and I'm very thankful to them. If you'd like to find a recording of this webinar and future webinars, you can find the NEMHSCA and NEMHSCA recordings at www.emphn.org.au and search for us. Thank you all for your time. Stay safe and well. Goodbye.